Millions of Americans celebrating Juneteenth for the first time. The unofficial holiday commemorating the end of slavery was thrust into the spotlight this year as protests against racial injustice swept across the nation. A grim warning from the World Health Organization. It says a global pandemic is entering a new and dangerous phase as governments ease restrictive measures, even though cases are surging in many parts of the world. And as the UN marks World Refugee Day, France 24's reporters investigate how the global pandemic has added to difficulties for over 1 million people who fled to Lebanon from war-torn Syria. It was June 19th in 1865, more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, that a handwritten note informed 250,000 enslaved black people in Texas that they were in fact free. Since then, Juneteenth has become an unofficial holiday, though many Americans were unaware of it until it was thrust into the spotlight this year as protests against racial injustice swept across the country. In recent weeks, multiple black people have died in police custody, creating a moment of soul-searching for the nation. Allison Sargent reports.
For Black Americans, it's long been a day of commemoration and celebration. But this year, Juneteenth is being marked on a grand scale and by an increasingly diverse slice of America.
I feel like this is a volcano that's finally erupted, and the changes have truly come to America.
And I decided it was time for me to get brave and come out and, lend a hand.
We already removed 4 statues, and we are working on to remove all Confederates.
Juneteenth is a mix of June and 19th, the date in 1865 that the last enslaved Americans in Galveston, Texas, learned that they had been freed. The message didn't come until 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and over 150 years later, Black Americans say freedom is a dream that continues to be deferred.
We have never truly been free in America, but that's what this movement is about today. It's about a reminder that we are not truly free, that there's so much work that needs to be done.
A nationwide reckoning with America's racial inequalities has made this year's Juneteenth different. From the higher rate of coronavirus deaths in the Black community to the police killing of Black people like George Floyd.
America, when will we be able to breathe? America, when will you become great?
No justice, no peace.
All but 3 U.S. states formally recognize Juneteenth, and on Friday, U.S. senators announced legislation to declare it a federal holiday, which some hope will one day gain the same significance as the 4th of July.
And this Saturday, Donald Trump kicks off his re-election campaign in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Meanwhile, the state Supreme Court rejected a legal bid to stop Trump's rally on Saturday over concerns that it could spread the coronavirus. Cases are surging in Oklahoma, and the president also has been accused of being tone deaf for selecting Tulsa in the first place, as it was the site of one of the worst race massacres in America's history. Well, ahead of the November election, polls show Democrat Joe Biden increasing his lead over Trump. For some analysis, let's speak to Richard Johnson, a lecturer in U.S. politics at Lancaster University. Mr. Johnson, thank you for speaking to France 24. I'd like to begin by asking you, according to a Fox News poll released on the eve of Trump's rally, 59% of voters think that political rallies at this time are a bad idea amid the coronavirus. But the question is, do you think his base feels the same way?
Well, I think based on what they've said in terms of the registration numbers, talking about up to 1 million people have registered interest for an arena of 19,000. There's clearly interest from his supporters. But I think this is highly risky for the president. I think that if this rally becomes notorious as being a kind of super spreader event, then it will have long-term repercussions for the rest of the campaign in terms of his ability to get similar crowds at future rallies. Maybe this time people will take a chance, but if it's revealed that a lot of people end up getting very ill and dying, then I think it'd be hard for him to continue to reproduce that, even among his own supporters.
There's a number of different risks for Trump here that could give him a possible misstep in his campaign, from how he's handling the pandemic, as well as the Black Lives Matter protests. Those are ongoing. But also there's trade, and then we saw the recent Supreme Court siding with Dreamers. What do you think is Trump's biggest obstacle moving forward, and what he'd like to have under his belt as a possible victory during this campaign season?
I think it's got to be the economy and then the coronavirus. And obviously those two things are related. Trump has premised his re-election effectively on delivering a boom economy. And, before coronavirus, I think there was some evidence that that was probably his best chance of getting re-elected, and his chances of re-election were not brilliant, but were not bad before coronavirus. I think now he's in the most politically precarious part of his presidency. I've not really thought that his chances of re-election have been as low as they've been over the last couple of weeks. The numbers for him nationally, his national approval ratings have dipped, but really also looking at the polling in key states, he's doing very badly in states that he won by surprise in 2016, and he's also doing badly in some states that he won that shouldn't even really be up for competition in this cycle. So I think unless he can really demonstrate strong economic growth and low coronavirus cases in the autumn, then I think his presidency is in serious danger.
But one of the problems we had with 2016 was a lack of data coming out of some of these swing states and the polls. Is there a chance we're doing this again in 2020, that the media or the pollsters could be underestimating Donald Trump?
I think it's important to caveat the polls and not to, these polls are snapshots of where we are now. They're not predictions of what will happen in November. A lot can happen between now and November. There is some discussion that the state level polls don't use as much sophisticated weighting as the national polls. And in the last election cycle, that failure to wait for particularly non-college white working class voters failed to capture a differential swing among that group of voters who were decisive in the Midwest and Rust Belt states. But I also think there's a risk that pollsters end up fighting the last battle, and there is a risk of overcorrecting, of sort of, kind of almost hoping to see the same mistakes again. So what I would say is that the polls are bad for Trump now. But what I would also caution is that, this election is not over. If there's a 4 or 5 percentage point shift in the polls between now and November, it's a very different scenario.
Indeed, and the polls bad for Trump now means they're good for Joe Biden, his Democratic rival. Now, Biden's held few events due to this pandemic and had a somewhat play it safe campaign. But what does Biden need to do moving forward to increase his lead over Trump?
It seems that his strategy lately has been, has paid off. When your opponent is making lots of mistakes, why interrupt them? But there is a risk that if that strategy were to persist, it could be perceived as a complacent strategy. And Trump going out to Tulsa now, in spite of huge public health risks, shows that Trump is willing to really get out there and basically put everything on the line for his re-election. And so, campaigns are also about momentum. Biden needs to be able to ensure that Trump doesn't capture some kind of late momentum, particularly if, people start to kind of see the economy and the coronavirus in relative terms, and people in kind of October time, November time say, well, it's better than it was 6 months ago. Things are improving. Biden can't allow Trump to develop that narrative. So I think Biden needs to start to think about big announcements. I think his vice presidential announcement will be one of those that will, not too long from now, that'll really help him to try and build some momentum for his campaign.
All right. Thank you very much for your time and your analysis, Dr. Richard Johnson from Lancaster University. Well, take a look at what Donald Trump called a disgrace on Twitter. Protesters had toppled Washington, D.C.'s only statue of a Confederate general, this one of Albert Pike. The demonstrators wrapped 2 ropes around the statue, pulling it down and then dousing it with lighter fluid and setting it on fire. A bill was introduced back in 2017 to take the statue down, but it had stalled in the House of Representatives. Well, moving on to the coronavirus, and Brazil passed the 1 million total cases mark. It came as the country reported a new one-day record for infections at over 54,000. The health ministry claimed the figure was higher than expected because some states were reporting figures from multiple days. Nationwide, just under 50,000 people have died, second only to the U.S. Meanwhile, other countries in the region, including Mexico, Chile, and Peru, are also struggling to contain major outbreaks. Aximar's Belkin reports on how infection rates are accelerating across Latin America.
The world is in a new and dangerous phase.
Europe may be largely emerging from lockdown, but for the World Health Organization, now is not the time for complacency.
The virus is still spreading fast. It is still deadly, and most people are still susceptible.
Of particular concern, the Americas, the source of almost half of all new viral transmissions. On Friday, Brazil passed the grim milestone of 1 million cases. That as the country reported almost 54,800 new infections on Friday, the largest single-day jump since the start of the outbreak. Detractors of President Jair Bolsonaro attributing the crisis to the far-right leader's prioritizing of the economy over public health.
Comprometimento com o combate, né? Ele estava saindo sem máscara, cumprimentando, participando de aglomerações. Ele acredito que ele é o principal responsável pela nossa situação.
A difficult day for Mexico too, as the country's death toll surpassed 20,000, amid fears that quarantine fatigue has set in. Meanwhile, a number of US states are also experiencing COVID rebounds. And there's been a worrying resurgence of the virus in parts of Asia. Chennai, for example, in southern India, is back under lockdown once again, less than a fortnight after earlier restrictions were lifted. The Middle East is also seeing a steady progression of the pandemic, with Egypt passing the threshold of 50,000 infections on Thursday.
Well, June 20th marks World Refugee Day. Record numbers of people have been forced to flee their homes, and the global pandemic has only exacerbated a number of crises. To mark the day, France 24's team has been to Lebanon, meeting some of the more than 1 million Syrian refugees living in the country.
8 years ago, Aisha and her family arrived here in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley after fleeing Syria's bloody civil war. They built a one-room shack, extending it bit by bit, and started to feel at home. But since a catastrophic economic crisis hit Lebanon late last year, their lives have been turned upside down all over again.
كانت منيحة يعني كان نشتغل المواد الغذائية كانت كلها رخيصة الأمم كانت يعني منيحة بس بعد الكورونا ما لا ضل شغل لا ضل المواد الغذائية كتير صارت غالية بدك تجيبي خضرة ما بتروحي بتطلع على الخضرة بترجع ما فيك تشتري شيء يعني.
Aisha's cousin Badawi used to do casual manual labour, but hasn't had work in months thanks to the COVID-19 lockdown. Meanwhile, prices have doubled or even tripled as the Lebanese lira's value crashes. His wife works 13-hour days in the agricultural fields nearby for just 20 cents an hour. She now has to work for 4 hours to afford a litre of milk.
يعني المعيشة صارت صعبة هلا صار والله في عيال اللحمة ما بشوفها غير عند اللحام.
These families are from Homs, a region of Syria that's been ravaged by the civil war. They don't even know if they have houses to go back to. They say they feel much safer in Lebanon and want to stay here if they can. But with the failing economy now unable to support them, they feel under pressure to consider returning to Syria sooner than they'd like.
نرجع بلادنا إذا مثلا رجعنا أكيد ما عنا بيوت إذا حطينا خيمة بأرض اللي كنا نحن قاعدين فيها البيت اللي إنه ما حد بيجي بيقول لك إنه أعطينا أجار هذا مرتاحة منه.
Aisha and Badawi and hundreds of thousands of families like theirs have built homes and communities here over nearly a decade. But as Lebanon becomes an increasingly difficult place for refugees to live, many will soon face a stark choice: stay here, barely able to survive, or face the unknown across the border in Syria.
That's the news for now. Thanks for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.